A Child is Born, A Beginner's Guide to Nativity Stories by Amy Jill Levine. This is Chapter 4, Jesus Heir to Tradition, pages 106 through 114. Here I am. Connections of Jesus to Isaac and to Moses are well documented, but we can also connect Mary to Abraham, Moses, and Samuel, among others. Our concern here is the response when God calls. Immediately following the expulsion of Hagar and Ishmael, we read that God tested Abraham, Genesis chapter 22, verse 1. This is the beginning of the Akedah, Hebrew binding, the story of how Abraham bound his son Isaac on the altar and prepared to sacrifice him. Abraham is not the only figure tested by God. The term for test, in Greek, is the same word used for the temptations by Jesus of Satan. It appears in the Our Father prayer, which implores, "Lead us not into temptation," or "Do not bring us to the test." The prayer adverts back to Abraham, in the sense of asking God not to put us in positions where we would choose self-interest over divine service. To begin this test, whether Abraham knew it was a test or not remains unstated. God calls Abraham. The patriarch responds, "Here I am." The Hebrew used here for the first time in the Bible is hineni. The Greek is idou, ego, literally behold or look, I am. Abraham is present to God as he is to his son. 7 verses later, when Isaac said to his father Abraham, "Father," Abraham responds, "Here I am, my son." Genesis chapter 22, verse 7. The analogy is beautiful. We should be as present to God the Father as we as parents are to our children. The phrase occurs a third time in the chapter when Abraham is about to sacrifice his son. The angel of the Lord, likely the same one who called to Hagar in the wilderness in the previous chapter and assured her that she would not see the death of her son Ishmael, called to Abraham from heaven. "Abraham, Abraham." Abraham responds, "Here I am." Genesis chapter 22, verse 11. This is what it means to be obedient to God, whether the test or the salvation. The response, "Here I am," shows up another 30 or so times in the Bible. For our purposes, 4 more underscore the gospel narrative. First, in Exodus chapter 3, verse 4, God calls to Moses from the burning bush, and Moses responds, "Here I am." This is the point where God commissions Moses to return to Egypt and tell Pharaoh to free the Hebrew slaves. Second, in 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 4, set after Hannah has delivered her son to Eli at Shiloh, God calls to the child, "Samuel, Samuel," and the child responds, "Here I am." The ideal is that when God calls us by name, we respond, whether with trepidation or joy or perhaps a combination. "Here I am." Third, God also responds, "Here I am." The relationship is reciprocal. Isaiah chapter 58, verse 9a explains, "Then you shall call, and the Lord will answer. You shall cry for help, and he will say, 'Here I am.'" Alternatively, in Isaiah 65, verse 1, the prophet speaks the words of God, "I was ready to be sought out by those who did not ask, to be found by those who did not seek me. I said, 'Here I am, here I am,' to a nation that did not call on my name." This is the same chapter of Isaiah in which God speaks of creating new heavens and a new earth, Isaiah chapter 65, verse 17. We can hear a faint echo of this response when Gabriel explains to Mary that she will give birth. She responds, "Behold," or "Look, I do." The slave of the Lord, Luke chapter 1, verse 38. The NRSVUE strengthens the connection by translating, "Here am I." The intertexts not only connect Mary to the ancient figures, they also connect the implications of her response. To be called by God does not usually signal a walk in the park. Abraham is initially called to sacrifice his son on the altar, as Mary will witness the death of her son on the cross. Moses, like Hagar, is called to return to slavery. Like Samuel and Jesus, he will face rejection, and he will attempt to lead a people who are not always inclined to listen to him. Mary connects herself to that ancient slavery, even as she will be aware that people will reject her son. As Simeon tells her when she presents baby Jesus in the temple, this child is destined for the falling and the rising of many in Israel, and to be a sign that will be opposed. Luke chapter 2, verses 34. The circumcision of Jesus. Following the description of Ishmael's birth, Genesis 16, verses 15 through 16, the text returns to the covenant that God establishes with Abraham and his posterity. The sign of that covenant is the circumcision of all male members of Abraham's household, Genesis chapter 17, verses 11 through 14. Immediately following that notification, God tells Abraham that regarding Sarah, "I will bless her and also give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall give rise to nations. Kings of people shall come from her." Genesis chapter 17, verse 16. Abraham expresses concern regarding Ishmael, and God tells him not to worry. God will also bless Ishmael and make him a great nation. Genesis chapter 17, verse 20. But the covenant will go through Sarah's son. After this revelation, Abraham arranges the circumcision of himself at age 99, of Ishmael aged 13, and of the other males in the household. The following scene, Genesis 18, is the visitor's annunciation that Abraham and Sarah will have a son. In continuity with this covenant, Luke chapter 1, verse 59 through 64 reports how on the 8th day after his birth, John was to be circumcised. Elizabeth insists that the child be named John. Thus, Zechariah, who received the name from the angel, must have spoken with his wife. Shortly thereafter, Mary gives birth to Jesus. Luke chapter 2, verse 21 reports, "When the 8th day came, it was time to circumcise the child. And he was called Jesus, the name given by the angel before he was conceived in the womb." There are not many sermons these days on the circumcision of any of these individuals. Until 1960, a number of Christian churches celebrated the feast of the circumcision of Christ on January 1st. The date is 8 days after Christmas, and God instructed Abraham that all males born into his household should be circumcised on the 8th day after birth. Granted, people have had other things to do aside from celebrating a circumcision on New Year's Day. On the other hand, the connection of this part of the Christmas story to Genesis should not be cut off. I couldn't resist. First, in medieval thought, the very small amount of blood shed during the circumcision process signaled the beginning of salvation, since, as Paul puts it, we have now been justified by his blood, Romans chapter 5, verse 9. Second, the connection shows how the baby now embodies the covenant with Israel. Third, and this a historical point that I find fascinating, to this day, Jewish boys are formally named at the time of their circumcision. Our son Alexander was, to us, always Alexander, but to our synagogue, he was formerly baby boy Geller until his circumcision. Ironically, while this naming tradition is part of Jewish practice to this day, its first notice is actually the naming of John the Baptist in Luke chapter 1, verse 59. On the 8th day they came to circumcise the child, and they were going to name him Zechariah after his father. The second notice is Luke chapter 2, verse 21. "When the 8th day came, it was time to circumcise the child, and he was called Jesus, the name given by the angel before he was conceived in the womb." Today, circumcision tends to be restricted to Jewish and Muslim religious practices, although there is some medical indication that it protects against a number of unpleasant medical concerns. Yet it helps us understand not only the Christmas story, but our own lives as well. For the New Testament nativity accounts, it recollects the covenant with Abraham and the fidelity to that covenant of Elizabeth and Zechariah, and Mary and Joseph. For people today, it can remind us of the stories our bodies tell, especially by tattooing or piercing or various forms of surgery. I remember when I was a child, being fascinated by one of my father's friends from the Navy who had a ship tattooed on his arm. He could move his muscles in a way that made the ship look like it was pitching in the water. I also remember friends of my parents and of my grandmother who had numbers tattooed on their arms. No one talked about that. Bodies speak to our identities. Finally, there are marks that are invisible, but we know they are there. Instead of concentrating on the painful ones, I'd prefer to think of the hidden but permanent mark of baptism. Some people remember their baptisms, others were baptized as infants, still others were baptized several times in different churches. Since in both Greek and Hebrew, the expression we translate running water can also mean living water, every time a drop of rain falls, or one turns on the faucet, could there be a reminder of baptism and a concern to recommit? Retrospect. Book publishers and academics speak about elevator pitches, summaries of books or dissertations that can be done in the quick movement between floors. If we were to do elevator pitches of what looking at the stories of the Old Testament contribute to the New, we'd be on that elevator for days. But quick run-throughs can get us started. From the story of Hagar, we can better read the nativity stories in relation to slavery and freedom, and so to sin, a burden, a stain, a debt, and redemption, lifting off the burden, wiping away or covering over the stain, paying the debt. We can see how the stories relate both to Jews such as Joseph, Mary, and Jesus, but also to non-Jews such as the woman in Matthew's genealogy, the Magi, and the people in Egypt who provided shelter for Mary and Joseph. We can see the emphasis on ani, or tapenoisis, humiliation, destitution, and recognize the need for liberation from both spiritual, psychological, as well as physical oppression. Hagar tells us that God sees. Hagar, who also begins to see through her own eyes, both tells us that anyone can humiliate another, and anyone can be the agent of liberation. Sarah not only reminds us of Elizabeth, she shows us that sometimes we turn our own oppression on others. What Abraham did to her regarding Pharaoh, she does to Hagar regarding Abraham. Her resentment of Hagar is palpable, and so she becomes for us the opportunity for identification and for intervention. The Bible invites us to see ourselves in all the characters, and in doing so, learn from them. From Sarah, we also learn about the joy of physical intimacy between older adults, as the canons of the 1812 overture shake the earth. Samson's story also gives us comedy. There are serious moments in the Bible, but that is not all the Bible has to offer. If in reading the text we find ourselves smiling, as Sarah's comments regarding a forthcoming pregnancy, at Mrs. Manoah's conversation with the angel, and many more stories, we are more likely to see the laughter behind the Gospel's Christmas stories. Matthew's Joseph, son of Jacob, will remind us of that earlier Joseph, son of Jacob, who also dreamed dreams and took his family to Egypt to protect them, and recognition of that connection is joyful. We can find the humor in Luke's note that Mary put Jesus in a feeding trough, the famous manger, in anticipation that he will give his body as food. There is humor in the Magi asking King Herod, the nominal king of the Jews, about the location of the newborn king of the Jews. The story of Hannah gives us the importance of prayer. Jesus too will pray, and we can better understand how heartfelt his prayers are when we read him in light of Hannah. In Psalm 22 and other lament psalms, we can hear both Hannah and Jesus, and so we realize that we can pray these prayers ourselves. Eli gives us lessons in the problems of judging by appearances, the need for pastoral care, and the importance of assurance. He also tells us that sometimes children do not do what we would wish for them. Perhaps Samuel's righteousness filled in for him the loss he felt concerning his own unrighteous sons. Elkanah reminds me of Joseph. As Jesus tells Joseph that his father's house is not the home Joseph made for the family in Nazareth, so Elkanah realizes, because of his wife's vow, that his son Samuel will not live with the family in their house in the hill country of Ephraim. The story of Moses is the model for Jesus in Matthew 1 through 2, and indeed throughout the gospel. The focus on the infancy material gives us stories of women, of courage, of cooperation, and of political subversion. Jesus knew, from stories of his ancestor David and from stories about Moses, that sometimes one has to fight for what one knows to be right. He knows that rejection is not the end of the story. He knows that God hears.